Very happy everyone is here. I haven't been here to talk on Wednesday night in a while, so I'm a bit rusty, I think. But it feels good to see everyone and talk about some matters that are of great importance to us as United Methodists these days. Some of you may have heard that the United Methodist Church is going through some time of transition. Anyone heard that rumor? Yeah, something about that. Tamara and I just got back from New Mexico last night. We flew out to visit Jeremy and the grandkids, and he took us up to Taos. Anyone been to Taos in New Mexico? Yeah. Beautiful place up in the mountains. And I had not been there before, but it was one of the things that I noticed as we're driving down the main strip past Kit Carson's house was the Indian United Methodist Church. And of course, the Taos Indians, that is a pueblo that goes back 500, 600, maybe 1,000 years. It's had a very interesting, long history. Very strong Native American presence there in New Mexico. And here was this United Methodist Church, specifically for the indigenous peoples of the region. And I thought about how that connected very nicely with the discussion we're going to be having over the next 3 weeks, starting tonight, about our connection as Methodists. Because as a Methodist, that church there is not just a place where I am welcome, but it's also a place where I am called to serve. And so are you. And we are connected beyond our geography and beyond our local church, which is one of the really important parts of the conversation for us to have, is about the nature of our connectedness, which goes back to the very beginnings of the Methodist movement, all the way back in the 18th century, starting with the Wesleys. So those of you who know me know that I'm a historian both by training and disposition, which means I can't tell a story without backing up about 10 steps to get a good running start. And so I thought tonight we would spend some time sort of rehearsing our history. How we got to this point, and then the next couple weeks we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the theology and the structure of the Methodist Church and how this all sort of fits together into what John Wesley referred to as our practical divinity. The connection we have with one another for John Wesley was not just a practical matter, not just a matter of efficiency and organization. From the very beginning of the Methodist movement, our connectedness was essential to our identity and our relationship to God. Wesley understood it as an outworking of our relationship to God. It was the practical application of our beliefs. And so for us as Methodists, to be bound together says something very much about who we are, but also whose we are, and how we work together to affect the kingdom of God. So that's sort of the long sort of view over the next 3 weeks. For those of you who sort of have grown up, and let me start there. How many of you grew up in the Methodist Church? Okay, all right, maybe half, okay, which means the rest of you did not. That's pretty obvious. I like to tell folks that I am a Methodist by choice, not by birth. I became a Methodist. I grew up, as some of you know, in the Pentecostal tradition, which has some roots in Methodism going back, but a very different religious tradition than this one. And as I grew in both my sort of my faith understanding and my studies, Methodism became a very welcome refuge for me, spiritually and in every other way. And so I came to the Methodist Church as someone looking for a spiritual home, and landed and have been here now almost 40 years. I've spent more of my life within Methodism than I did before that. And so I very much consider myself to be a Methodist by virtue of that history. So for those of you who sort of grew up in it, you have a better understanding perhaps of the structure and the rules that sort of govern what it means to be Methodist. I could say Methodist women, and suddenly you would all know what that means. But for a generation later, what does that mean? One of my favorite stories has to do with my daughter, and they're not down here anymore. Do you all remember when we had the pictures, the portraits down here? We had John and Charles, I think Susanna was, we had these portraits of sort of the older men. My daughter, when she was much younger, came down and she was in the youth group at a younger age, and she came in, she looked around, she goes, "Why are all these pictures of presidents down here?" She had no idea, right? And I thought, oh man, I've got work to do. But it was an appropriate question, I suppose. On your tables, you have some handouts that I'd like to sort of walk through with you as we begin to think about our Methodist identity and what it means to be connected to one another and to the larger church. One thing I would like to start with is that each Sunday we recite the Apostles' Creed. I did not grow up in a church that had or appreciated the creeds. We didn't do that. In fact, we didn't even know what they were. And in some ways, the group I grew up with was kind of proud of that. They were sort of, we don't have to worry about tradition. Tradition is one of those bad things. And so that was not something that I grew up around. But as I grew in my faith and as I studied, I very much came to appreciate the importance of the creeds. And there is that phrase that we have in the third stanza of the Apostles' Creed, which says, "I believe in the communion of the saints." We say that every Sunday. And that means that we, in this local church in 2023, are connected to other churches around the world that may or may not have Methodist above the door. We're also connected to all of those Christians over the past 2,000 years who have attempted to follow Jesus. And we also belong to those in the future who will look back at us and think about what legacy did we leave for them. And so every Sunday we affirm our connectedness when we recite the creed. And the creed itself is this distillation of early Christian theology into what are the essential points of Christian belief? Well, they're there, and we recite them every Sunday. So we begin every week by reaffirming our connectedness to one another and to one another. And it's a beautiful and powerful thing when you think about it, that we are part of this extended family across space and time. And so it's built into our DNA as Christians, but it's specifically true for us as Methodists as we have sort of begun to work out that in our life and our mission. So, sort of to begin here at the beginning, as they say, you have one that starts with the historical divisions in the Christian church. You all see that one? Yours is white, mine's yellow, but that side of the page. Are they on flip sides? Okay. All right. So we're starting here at about the year 30. This would be the year that historians, church scholars would say, this is the year we're talking about the death and what Christians believe as the resurrection of Jesus. And we put this around the year 30, right? We don't know exactly. We're within a year or two, but year 30 is a good approximate date. The early church grows from that time. If you've been in the Sunday school class that meets down here on Sundays, we've been reading through the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is the first history of the history of Christianity and takes it through about its first 30 years or so. up until not quite the death of Paul, but from this the day of Pentecost for about the next 30 years. So a generation or so. When we get to that point, and it's important for folks to remember this, when we get to that point in the mid-decade of the 60s, when we have the deaths of Peter and Paul, it's only at that point that we probably have the composition of the first gospel. The first generation of Christians did not have a New Testament. They relied on the testimony of the apostles and the stories that were handed down. Oral tradition guided the Christian community for the first generation. The Gospel of Mark, probably written somewhere around the year 65. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark come 20 years later in the decade of the 80s. The Gospel of John doesn't come around probably until the early 90s. So what we consider to be the essential parts of the New Testament, the Gospels, we don't even have them until almost 60 years after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The church is bound together over this time by its connectedness to the apostles and then those whom the apostles designated to succeed them. If you read the letters of St. Paul, he starts talking about presbyters, and he talks about bishops, and he talks about, there's a whole sort of array of church leaders. Christianity survived, we would say, by the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But the Holy Spirit worked through the establishment of a body of books, documents, literature. We decided to save the letters of Paul. It's not as if Paul woke up one morning and said, my, it's a beautiful day. I'll have my coffee and I think I'll write part of the Bible today. It didn't work out that way. And we certainly know that the Bible didn't fall out of heaven like a sacred meteor wrapped in black leather with the words of Jesus in red. And it sure wasn't in King James English, right? We know that, right? It takes a long time for the church to pull these elements together. It has scriptures, and then it decides we have to have some level of authority that binds us together, and you begin to develop a church structure and a church order. And then there are the sacraments. There are certain rituals that we hold on to as essential rituals. We have the Lord's Supper. We have baptism. These become essential ways to bind all Christians together, regardless of whether they live in Ethiopia or Jerusalem or Rome. They don't speak the same language, but they're bound together by this web of connection that holds us together. By about the year 100, Christians start using the word Catholic. Catholic means universal. And it was a way for early Christians to affirm their unity across time and space. We belong to the Church Catholic, as opposed to, I belong to the Church of Jim Bob, or I belong to the Church of Joe. No, you belong to the Church Catholic, or you don't belong to Christ, because it's not about the individual. It's about the community that is seeking to follow the person of Jesus. And so that word Catholic begins to be an important word for early Christians, binding them together. For the first 300 years or so of Christianity, Christianity is technically an illegal religion. We are not a legal sect within the Roman Empire. We are seen as, today we would use the word occult. And Christians were accused of all sorts of things, right? Christians were accused of being cannibals. Did you hear? They eat the body and the blood. They must be cannibals. There are all kinds of stories about all this. It's really quite interesting. And they're antisocial. They don't come to our festivals, and they don't sacrifice to our gods. So they must be atheists, which is really ironic, right? And so all of these stories about Christians until we get to the year 312, 313, the Emperor Constantine wins a battle, and he becomes emperor. He's in a battle with another person for the emperorship. He wins, and as the story goes, he had prayed that if he saw a sign in the heavens, he would follow that and support it. And as the story goes, he saw an emblem of the cross in the sky. He understood that as a Christian symbol, and so he decided to become a patron of early Christianity. Well, that sounds like good political rhetoric. I'm not sure it's happened exactly that way, but certainly Constantine was aware that Christianity had grown in the empire, and to have the Christians on his side was probably a good move. And so he makes Christianity legal in the year 313. It's not until we get about the year 381 that Christianity becomes the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. 381. We have gone from being an outlaw sect that worshiped a criminal hung on a cross to being the only legal religion in the Roman Empire in the space of about 350 years. That is a remarkable story, right? The effect of that, though, is it changes the nature of Christianity. Where once Christians in the Christian community were outsiders, now they are the consummate insiders. They get money from the royal treasury to build churches and to appoint bishops. And the nature of Christianity begins to change, and not everybody's happy about that. What do we lose when we become cultural insiders? What do we lose when we have political power? A lot of Christians at the time were very concerned about that, and turns out with some legitimacy. Somewhere around this time, I would put it probably around the year 400, from a historian's perspective, we would say we have the emergence of what comes to be known as the Roman Catholic Church. And it's only in this sense because the bishop who resides over the Christian community in Rome, now at the seat of power, political power, really becomes the focus for Christianity in the western part of the Roman world. By this point, the Roman world is starting to divide between East and West, between those who speak Greek and Arabic and Coptic over in Egypt, and those who speak Latin in the West. And you begin to have a divide, a cultural divide within Christianity along geographical and political lines. I will save you all of the story because there's a whole lot of it, like 1,000 years worth. But by the time we get to the year 1054 on your sheet here, we've moved from 30 all the way down to 1054. Congratulations, you just finished the first semester, right? In about 5 minutes here.
4 years.
Yeah, it took 4 years to get there. Yeah, that's right. In 1054, we have the first major split within Christianity that we continue to see affecting the world today. Now, there were smaller ones before that, and some of those still exist, but the two major ones. And here we have what becomes known as the Roman Catholic Church, that looks to the bishop in Rome as the head of the community, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which actually is a collection of churches. And we end up with the Greek Orthodox Church, the Armenian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, eventually the Russian Orthodox Church. All of these, their problem was not that they disliked Rome, but they didn't like Rome telling them what to do, and again, with pretty good reason. And so this split, and you can take a map. If I had a map here, we'd just sort of go straight up from about Constantinople, straight north. On one side, you've got the Roman Catholic Church, and on the other side, you've got the Eastern Orthodox Church. This was a major split. It's a split somewhat about theology, somewhat about doctrine, but it was a lot about church authority and who's in charge and who gets to call the shots. And unfortunately, as I always like to tell folks, Politics has been part of the church from day one. I know, shocking, isn't it? From day one. You can't read the book of Acts. You can't read the letters of the Apostle Paul without recognizing that there was no golden age in the history of Christianity when we all got along and agreed on everything and everybody walked the same way. It hadn't been that way because the church is, God only knows why he did this, is made up of people, right? And we're pretty flawed, in case you hadn't noticed. And we have rivalries and we want our own way. And so from the very beginning, the church has struggled with how to maintain its connectedness, how to maintain its purity, and how to maintain its sense of openness and welcome. This has been part of the conversation from the very beginning of the church. And the kinds of things that the church is weathering today are only the latest manifestation of a very long story. In some ways, it's the same story. The characters have changed, maybe the issues have changed, but it's the same story. Is the church, one of the earliest arguments in the church was, is the church supposed to be a refuge for saints or a hospital for sinners? Are we supposed to be a church that protects us from the world, or one that welcomes the world and attempts to make a change? That is one of the fundamental arguments in the history of the church, and we continue to have it today, and we will have it until the end of time, whenever, as we say in the Creed, Christ returns. That is simply part of what it means to belong to the church and to struggle with this question of, how do I be a faithful disciple? How do I remain true to God and the faith and the scriptures in a way that is respectful to my community? It is an ongoing struggle for us. So, back to your chart here. The next major split, it's got the year 1500. Historians typically date this to about 1517 or 1520. Anyone ever heard of Martin Luther? Okay, good. Your Western Civ classes are coming back. This is good. All right. In 1517, an Augustinian monk in Germany by the name of Martin Luther has a crisis of faith. He's also a pastor. And in a peak, he runs out and posts on the internet of his day. He runs and puts a post on the door, right? He literally posts. Whether he actually did this or not, folks are divided, but he did something like this. He set a set of 95 propositions or 95 theses. And these were points of argument that he, as a good Catholic Christian, monk and priest, wanted to see his Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, debate, because he was very concerned that what he had seen going on in the Roman Catholic Church was not faithful to Scripture, was not leading folks into lives of piety and following the example of Jesus. The church, from his perspective, had become overly concerned with political power and wealth. And what he wanted to do was to reform his church. And to his dying day, Martin Luther said, I'm a good Catholic. Unfortunately, if you know anything about history, it didn't work out that way. And in 1521, Martin Luther is excommunicated, but instead of going quietly into the woods, Martin Luther becomes more vocal, he rallies, and we have the start of what becomes known as the Protestant Reformation. This is a split within Western Christianity. This doesn't directly affect the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church does not have a Reformation as we talk about it. This is an event that occurs from within Roman Catholic Christianity. So now, in the western part of the world, we have Roman Christianity, Roman Catholic Christianity, and we have Protestantism. Unfortunately, Protestants enjoyed reforming so much they couldn't get along with one another either, right? Sound familiar? In Germany, as you can see here on the chart, we have Martin Luther. Martin Luther is the leading figure, although he was never happy about being the founder of a church. That he never wanted to see himself that way, but history had other reasons. And so the Lutheran churches grew out of the reforms that occurred in Germany. In Switzerland, we had two folks, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin. I always like to say Ulrich Zwingli because I just like how it sounds. And I always try to encourage my students, you really ought to name at least one of your sons Ulrich. But nobody's taking me up on it. But I just like how it sounds. And then, of course, John Calvin. From John Calvin is what we end up with. Folks have heard of the phrase Calvinism. John Calvin, too, was a minister and a pastor. Whereas Luther was much more of the pastor, Calvin was much more of the active theologian. And he put together this compendium called the Institutes, which sort of gave a very detailed, systematic organization of Christian theology from his perspective. Calvinism is extremely important in the history of Christianity and has played an extremely important role in the history of Christianity in the United States up to the present. You want to know what's at the heart of the debates going on among Southern Baptists, particularly up at Southern Seminary in Louisville? It's over how Calvinist should they be. This is not just an old issue. This is very much a live issue, arguing over points of theology, because we as Christians think that our belief is important, right? And unfortunately, feeling that way sometimes leads to some disagreements, and some of them pretty vehement, right? But that's where we end up with. Coming out of that, then, you end up with the Reformed tradition, congregational. The Presbyterian Church, right down the street, is a Calvinist church in terms of its background and history and theology, right? Now, things get interesting for us, because then we go over to England. Folks have heard of King Henry VIII, right? Okay, well, King Henry was a jolly old soul, to be sure. But King Henry styled himself a theologian and churchman. In fact, the Pope awarded him the title Defender of the Faith, because Henry had written a document opposing Luther. Now, Henry was a pedestrian theologian at best, but he had sort of made this effort, right? The only problem is that Henry had a political problem in that he had a wife that did not give him a male heir. And so he needed a male heir, he thought, and he thought it must be her problem, which of course it wasn't. But nevertheless, he found a way to divorce her and to marry another. Well, that one didn't work either, and so he just went on down the line. But the woman that he divorced happened to be the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also connected to the Roman Pontiff, the Pope. And they said, no, you can't do this. If you do this, we will excommunicate you from the church. And Henry said, okay, go right ahead. I'll set up my own church, which is what he did, and put himself as the head of that church. It became known as the Church of England. That occurs around 1534. Queen Elizabeth, his legitimate heir, who comes later, reaffirms that, strengthens that, and the Church of England becomes a third wing of this Reformation. What's really interesting, though, is the Church of England was not formed because of religious and theological reasons, at least early on. Their theology and practice still looked pretty Roman, except without Rome. It looked very much like that. And even today, if you're to go into the Church of England, or particularly on a high Sunday here at Christ Episcopal Church, you might think that you've actually sort of wandered over to St. Joe's, because some things look and feel very similar. They certainly don't feel like you're at First Baptist, right? It's a very different kind of experience, or at the Presbyterian Church, right? So you have this other branch of Christianity now. The Anglican Church, that's another way of saying the churches of England. You can see there that the Methodist churches come out of the Anglican churches. That's where we originate. We'll pick up that story here in just a second. But one thing that's not on this little map here is to the far right. If you've got a pen and want to write it on there, put an arrow and put beside it radical. There was another wing of the Reformation. And this is the wing that said, hey, you folks, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Henry, you haven't really completely changed the church. You've simply rearranged the chairs. You still have this very hierarchical model with bishops and archbishops. That doesn't look, to me, these folks said, like what I read about in the New Testament. And furthermore, you're baptizing infants. And I can't read anywhere in the New Testament that says you've baptized an infant. It only talks about adults being baptized. And we want to be true to the New Testament. And furthermore, we want complete autonomy for each individual local congregation. We don't want anybody telling us out there how to live and how to practice, right? Now, they have some very good reasons for doing this, and I don't mean to sound dismissive, but I do want you to understand how different their perspective was. This group became what we know as the Amish and the Mennonites, right? Other groups, one of my favorite names, also one of those you need to say a lot of times just because it's fun, the Schwenkfelders. It's just a good name, right? But these were groups that were part of the Radical Reformation. They said, we do not wish to belong to this supposed Christian society that doesn't look very Christian. We will insulate ourselves and create our own Christian communities. And our individual churches will be autonomous. Okay? So, two other things I want you to write on this sheet of paper if you have it and you have control of the pen. All right? Above radical, where I just told you, you should write the word congregational. Congregation, A-L, congregational. Okay? And then above Germany, Switzerland, and England, write the word magisterial. I'll spell it for you. It's M-A-G-E-S-T-E-R-I-A-L, magisterial. And what that means is there are magistrates. Those on the left-hand side of this, under the Protestant Reformation, this is really important for us to think about going forward, continue to have a very highly developed church structure. And in almost every case, they were the official state church. If you were in certain principalities in Germany, it's not like you had an option. You're Roman Catholic, or you're Lutheran, or perhaps you're Calvinist if you're one of the sort of southern ones, right? If you are in Geneva, you're Calvinist, right? You're Reformed. If you're in England, you belong to the Church of England. And you have the power of the state, the government behind you, and a very highly developed structure. The radical reformers took themselves out of that structure and said each individual congregation is self-sufficient and autonomous. we will appoint, call, and dismiss our clergy. Right? No one's going to tell us who's going to be in our pulpit. We'll appoint them. The way this works out for us here is that the Puritans, you've heard of the Puritans, the folks with the funny hats, right? At Thanksgiving time, right? They were Calvinist, but they were also influenced by these radical reformers, and among them became groups known as separatists. The Pilgrims were separatist Puritans. And to go one step further, they also developed a sect known as the Baptists. What was unique about the Baptists, where they came out of the Church of England, out of the Puritan side, influenced by the radical reformers, and they held on to this notion of each individual congregation being self-sufficient and independent. Even today, Baptist churches struggle mightily with this. We've just seen this play out over the past several months within the Southern Baptist Convention. Because to be a Baptist means you believe in congregational polity or authority, each individual congregation. Well, some of those Southern Baptist churches appointed women as clergy. I have a friend who's one. She's been a Southern Baptist clergy person for 30 years. Well, the Southern Baptist Convention as a body said, wait a minute. If you're going to belong to us, you're out. And they say, wait a minute. We're Baptists. You can't put us out. This is who we are. You've affirmed that this is who we are. And so this is a central struggle for Baptist churches, is how do you maintain this congregational autonomy, which is central to their identity, and yet belong to a denomination that sets some broader rules. All right? For Methodists, things get really interesting from the get-go. You all heard, I hope, of John Wesley. He was one of those presidents' pictures on the wall over there, right? We need to bring those back down here, right? All right. John Wesley, founder of the movement we now know as Methodism, born in 1703, died in 1791. His brother Charles, 4 years younger. Both of them were brought up in a Church of England pastor's home. They were brought up as preacher's kids, right? Not very wealthy preacher's kids. Well, maybe that's an oxymoron, right? I don't know of too many, unless you're on TV or something, but I won't go there. John and Charles grew up in a very pious home. They were very much influenced by their mother, Susanna. They headed off to college. And when they got to Oxford, they found other like-minded, religiously committed people and formed a club. They really needed to work on their advertising because the only name they could come up with was the Holy Club. I mean, who's going to come to the Holy Club? But they had some. And they committed to themselves that they would meet, now get this, they would meet daily for 3 hours for Bible study and religious conversation. They would be attentive regularly to Holy Communion, at least once a week, if not every day. They committed to Bible study, very detailed Bible study, and to living ethical lives. And they had to report on their progress to their colleagues there. This was serious business for these guys, this group of individuals. Other folks looked at me and said, oh, good grief. They're so methodical. They're a bunch of Methodists. And the name stuck. It wasn't initially a compliment, but it's a name that eventually stuck. John and Charles both go on to become ordained clergymen within the Church of England. And until the day he died, that never changed for John Wesley. He saw himself as a faithful member of the Church of England, and he would bristle when folks would say, "Oh, you founded the Methodist Church." And he'd say, "No, I did not." For John and Charles and those who were around him, what they wanted to do was to reform the Church of England from the inside out. They wanted to take what they had done at Oxford with this small group of colleagues and expand that to the rest of the church so that individuals, lay people, ordinary people, would have an experience of grace, would read the scriptures, study them, and understand themselves as children of God who experienced God's grace. And they didn't feel that that necessarily was being communicated on a weekly basis in the churches and the pulpits in the Church of England at the time. Some were, but not all. And so the first thing we need to understand about Methodism is that it begins as an attempt to reform the Church of England, not to leave it. John and Charles did not wish to divide the Church of England. It becomes a problem, however, because of opposition. As you can imagine, some of the Church of England priests were not too happy that John was out there preaching in the fields, right? And moreover, he associated with other kinds of scalawags, like George Whitefield, the guy who went over and held these revivals in the colonies, right? And we don't know about these folks, and they're saying not such nice things about us, or folks think they are. And so increasingly, pressure was put upon Wesley and those around him to either cease what they were doing in any kind of public way, or to register with the state, with England, as a dissenting sect. You had to literally sign your name as "I am a member of." And there was some legal protection for you to do that. But John did not wish to do that because he did not wish to divide the Church of England. But things had gotten so difficult that by about the year 1787, John told those who were around him, "Go ahead and register." What that meant was the Methodist churches had officially registered as an alternative religious community to the Church of England. And it was one of those things that to the day he died, John Wesley regretted. Not regret in the sense I wish we hadn't done that, but I wish we didn't have to do that. Because for him, the unity of the church was an essential part of what it meant to be a Christian, to be bound together even with those with whom you do not agree, and maybe especially with those. And John felt politically he had no choice. He was put into a corner, and for the sake of the movement, he had to agree to this compromise. In 1763, John issues what's called the model deed for a preaching house. I think this was in Bristol, if I'm not mistaken. And we'll talk more about this next week. But this began to line out the rules for how Methodist societies, which is what the word was, if you were attending one of these Methodist groups, you would be also attending, at least early on, the regular worship of the Church of England. Methodist meetings were not held when Anglican church services were going on. Why? Because that's where you needed to be. Most of the early leaders and preachers in the Methodist movement were lay people, like you and like me, were not ordained clergy, could not give the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. And John said it's absolutely adamant for you as a faithful Christian to be attentive to the Lord's Supper. You ought to go at least once a week, if not every 4 days. It was really important. And we had these letters from John later on following up and coming to the colonies and saying, you guys really need to do this every week. It's really important, every week if you can. The practicality of it, because we had so few clergy here, was that eventually it couldn't happen that way, at least not early on. But John really wanted that. And so he began to set up rules for these societies on how they should operate. And those within his circle, he said, belong to the connection. He spelled it with an X, which I really like. I'm going to start using it that way. Connection with an X. And what that meant was these are the folks who are in connection with Mr. Wesley. They believed the same things as Mr. Wesley. They preached the same things as Mr. Wesley. They practiced the same things as Mr. Wesley. And they agreed to go wherever Mr. Wesley told them to go. Fundamental to this early part of the Methodist movement was what we now refer to as itinerancy. The fact that preachers, either lay preachers or eventually ordained preachers, go wherever, as we come to talk about it now, the bishop sends them. Wherever Mr. Wesley sent them, because the most important thing is the mission. The local congregation will remain because it's led primarily by lay people, ordinary people who are doing the work in the community. The preacher comes in and the preacher goes out, and Mr. Wesley sends that preacher where he is needed most. In fact, if you keep a preacher too long, you're going to really get tired of him. You get tired of the sermons, you're just going to stop going altogether. Right, Craig? Never happened to you. No. Okay? Never happened. Never happened. But it was absolutely essential because one of the notions of connection was that we are bound together for mission. Our purpose is to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ to all people, wherever they may be found, and those who are in most desperate need. Our mission takes us where we are needed. And if that means that this preacher has to go over here and leave here, then so be it. That's the way this works. And you know what? You need to trust Mr. Wesley on this. And if you didn't trust Mr. Wesley on this, you can go find another group. Mr. Wesley was not a good Democrat or Republican, for that matter. In fact, Mr. Wesley did not support the American Revolution at all. This notion of democracy, this is craziness. It's going to lead to chaos. Maybe he was right. It's going to lead to chaos, right? And this is not a good thing, right? But as we'll talk about, the majority of those who are now preaching in the colonies and what become the United States, of course, did support the revolution. And John Wesley lost that argument on this side of the Atlantic anyway. The other argument that John Wesley lost was what to call the leaders of the community. Initially, we're sending out these lay leaders, these lay preachers. Lay preachers were not allowed to give communion. They weren't ordained. And John Wesley, for the longest time, said, well, and we can't ordain them, right? They have to be ordained through the regular order of the church going up through the Church of England. Well, of course, the authorities in the Church of England said, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to support your movement. And so eventually, John Wesley relented and said, for the sake of the movement, we're going to have to agree to do this because I am, he said, a presbyter and an elder in the church. And as he understood and read the New Testament, elders, presbyters, bishops had the authority to ordain others to go and work. And so he agreed to do that. In 1771, he sent one of these folks, a lay preacher at the time, over to the American colonies, a man by the name of Francis Asbury. And little did he know what stick of dynamite he had sent over here, because Francis Asbury was a powerful presence, right? He also ordained and sent a new leader to the American colonies, a man by the name of Thomas Coke. And Thomas Coke was in fact ordained and was appointed as a superintendent. So the way the Methodist movement sort of originated, you had Wesley, you had those around Wesley who he then set out, and they built established societies. Very often they met in homes or in public places. They didn't have church buildings for the most part, but they were societies. And as those societies got too big, he said, well, for what we're trying to do here, what we really need are small group studies. And we're gonna call them something else, right? And so he calls them classes. And you'd have 11 members to a class with a leader. And then those folks together would make the society. And then all of those Methodist societies in a surrounding region, right, would have a superintendent over them in a region. And they would meet together at least once a year in something they called a conference. Christian conferencing, said Wesley, is another means of grace, like preaching and Bible study and prayer and the sacraments. This is one means by which grace comes to the individuals and to the church as a whole, right? Conferencing. Well, in the United States, the new United States, in 1784, we have a conference in Baltimore. It's called the Christmas Conference of 1784, and we have the birth of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States. Wesley hated the name, hated it, because we use the word Episcopal. We don't have bishops, you don't have an episcopate, you've got superintendents. And Coke and Asbury said, well, you know, the word's the same in the Greek, we're going to go with Episcopal. It's all the same to you. And Wesley said, well, it's not all the same to me, but he didn't win. And so the Methodist Episcopal Church was born in 1784. And so here's how this all ties back together. Methodism is an attempt to blend both sides of this divide within Christian structure. An Episcopal system where you have a bishop, but a very strong, powerful local congregation in which you have local leaders who are invested in the mission, right? And are committed to one another, but not just to one another sitting around the table over a love feast on a Wednesday night gathering, but to those other societies on the other side of the town and in the next town over and in London and in New York. And you're bound together in this web, this family relationship, which Methodists like to refer to as a connection, right? We are not isolated Christians. We belong to a family. I believe in the Holy Catholic Church. And that is central to the Methodist identity from the very beginning, to try and marry this ongoing debate about how do we organize our churches so that we're effective, so that we reach the need of one another and the community. And this is how Methodists decided to do it. Is it a perfect structure? Well, of course not. It's created by human beings, right? But it is a way. It is a uniquely Methodist way. And it's worked more or less for a couple hundred years now, right? So what we'll do next week is we'll unpack a little bit more of the history on sort of American Methodism, but then we'll get into the theology of the connection a little bit more next week and sort of unpack that. Does anybody have any questions here at the end? Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun having to do this.
It's like being back in college again, so thank you, Larry.
You're welcome.
I've always said Larry's my favorite professor. It's still true. So I've really enjoyed tonight and looking forward to the next 3 weeks. Just briefly, I remember what I loved about John Wesley, and one of my favorite books in seminary was Wesley's 52 Sermons. Okay, now 52. What else? What does 52 bring to mind to you? This was for his pastors going out to serve churches. He even wrote their sermons for them. Say, go preach this. But that was his way, and I think it's Methodism. Our role is to lift the church up. And that was Wesley. Wesley had no intention to be lifted up himself. He wanted folks like us to do well, and he equipped his pastors to do that well. And it wasn't my first Sunday here, but I felt like I was a very good Methodist on the first Sunday we were back in person. I remember I woke up and I had 102, 101 temperature that morning. I couldn't come, middle of the pandemic. So I gave Lee my sermon. I said, Lee, read my sermon. And there was no less importance, no less significance to whose mouth it came out of, because it was more important that it get shared. It didn't matter who it came from for that. And for me, I'm proud of who we are because of that. So Larry, thank you. Be sure you come back next week and bring a friend with you as well. Let me offer a blessing before we go home tonight. God, we continue to pray for your church, both here and in the world, both Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists and Catholic, non-denominational, Protestant, Orthodox. We are Church Catholic. We are all God's children, and help us to see one another as such. God, you are good, and we love you. As we go home tonight, help us to rest well, and may we awake tomorrow knowing that you go before us in all things. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Go in peace.
Thank you.